Good morning. It's good to have you here as we continue through the book of Genesis. For those of you at home, I'm sorry we missed last week. We had some technical difficulties. What you missed is one of the really cool chapters of Genesis, though, about dealing with the sons of Jacob and the town of Shechem. I told you that Genesis, this part of Genesis anyway, is like I've been telling you it's like a daytime soap opera. Last Sunday was like a Mexican telenovela. The big storyline is that Jacob's daughter was hanging around with the people of the town of Shechem. She got raped, and so then they tried to bargain to buy her. And Jacob's sons, being good sons of Jacob, knew how to deceive people. And so they said, no problem, we'll do it, but first you have to be circumcised. So they were willing to circumcise themselves, and on the third day, when they were too sore to move around, they killed them all. So that's the story that you missed. You didn't get the application there, but that's the story that you missed last week. We are now moving on this morning to Genesis chapter 36. And when you look at it, you're going to go, oh no, but don't worry, we're not going to go verse by verse in this one, because it is a chapter of genealogies. It is the genealogy of Esau and the nation that he founded, which was called Edom. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take you through that and tell you the story of Edom is fascinating. This is great for Bible scholars and for people who are tracing people here and then when they show up later and things like that. But for our purposes today, let's just look at Edom itself. One of the things that if you've been with me for almost 2 years now, one of the things you've certainly learned is how to draw a map of the Holy Land. And so let's do that again one more time, and let's see what this means about Edom. And remember, if you're drawing the Holy Land, always begin with a blob up at the top. Draw a line out of that blob into a bigger blob down at the bottom, and that is the Sea of Galilee. Out of the Sea of Galilee flows the Jordan River, and the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, of course, is still around. It's still the lowest point on the earth. It is the most saline of all bodies of water. Even if you can't float, you can float on the Dead Sea. You can drive to it today from Israel or from Jordan. And so you might go to YouTube and just look at Dead Sea videos. It's kind of cool. So there's the Dead Sea right there. And then here's the coastline over here, and there's the Mediterranean Sea. And this right in here is the Promised Land. And down here, we're headed to Egypt. Now, where Abraham came from is over here with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Remember, he started out here with Ur. Now, so when next we find them, right now, the nation, and the nation at this point is just Jacob's family, they are back in the Promised Land, there with all the Canaanites, etc. Now remember the story of Jacob and Esau separated himself from Jacob, and where Esau went, and that's what this chapter is about. That's why we need to get to it. Where Esau went is over here on the east side of the Dead Sea. This is the land of Edom over here. Probably the most famous place in Edom today is the city of Petra, Petra. And if you've never looked around at Petra, you need to do that. Again, go to YouTube and just put in Petra. Put in City of Petra, because there's a singing group also, and you'll get a bunch of music videos. But City of Petra, and it is one of the most unique places in all the world. It is a city carved in stone. It is practically impregnable, because if you're going into Petra, no more than there's a place where it narrows to where only one person at a time can get in. Fascinating place. Very far advanced and everything like that in terms of the kind of buildings and the water structures that they had there and stuff like that. And there are, and I'll just throw this out and you can check it out if you want to. There's some Bible scholars who believe that Petra will again be in the news later on when the Antichrist is persecuting the nation of Israel, that they will flee into the city of Petra for protection. And even today, it is a hard city, a practically impossible city to attack. So anyway, this is hilly, mountainous area over here. It's desert. It's not great land except for some grazing, which is what Esau and his family did. So they moved over here to the area of Petra. I'm sorry, to the area of Edom. Now later on, when the Israel was in Egypt and they came back, what they wanted to do is they wanted to go through the land of Edom to get to the promised land. And Edom, even then there was animosity. There's always been animosity. After Esau, always animosity between the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, and the Jews. And so the Edomites would not let the Jews go through. And Moses told them, that's your brother, Israel, that's your brother. And so don't fight them, because they gathered an army up there and said, no, you're not going through. And so they found another way through, but they actually refused to let them through their country to get back into the promised land. Edom was constantly on the outs with Israel. Just like Esau and Jacob had been on the outs, Edom and Israel were constantly on the outs with each other. All throughout the time of the nation of Israel, and then the divided country of Israel and Judah. Now, when David was on the throne here in Israel, when David was on the throne, that was a golden age for Israel in terms of their riches, their authority, their military might, and then his son Solomon carried that on. And still the same military might, but it even increased their lands, their wealth, etc. And so during the time of David and Solomon, they actually ruled the land of Edom. It was a vassal state to Israel. After that, they broke away. Well, what happened was that there were some guys, if you go on down here, this is Saudi Arabia down here under this where the map does not extend. And there was a group of people called the Nabateans. They're the ones who actually built Petra. Petra is in what was Edom's territory, but the Nabateans built it. The Nabateans moved in, and they took the land of Edom. And what happened was, over a period of time, the Edomites began to move in and to settle in southern Judah, what was Judah at the time. Now, how did that happen? At one point, the Judah or Israel ruled them, and how in the world did they get in to do that? Well, Israel divided, remember, into Israel on the north and Judah on the south, and got progressively weaker over a period of time. The Babylonians came down from over here. They came down and conquered them. And when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, the Edomites were some of the ones who sort of like vultures, like came in and they wanted to not only encourage the Babylonians and ally themselves with the Babylonians, but also to kind of take advantage of the fact that Israel's army was now gone and the major leaders of the country had been deported back to Babylon. And so the Edomites took advantage of that. They moved into this area and they became, remember, the Nabateans had pretty much taken their land, and so they moved in to southern Judah. That land that they moved into came to be called Idumea, which is just another name in another language for Edom. And so they lived down here as in the southern part of Judah. What's the important part of that? Again, not good relations at all with the Jews. The Jews did convert a bunch of them in terms of getting them to be circumcised and become proselytes to the Jewish religion. So a number of them were. There was one fairly famous guy who was an Idumean who became famous later on, and his name was Herod. His father's name was Antipater, and he was a Jewish convert. He ruled with the okay of the Romans, and Jews did not like him at all, partly because, just like Herod, he wanted to be a Jew, but he was not. He was still an Idumean. And so they sort of saw him as a Johnny-come-lately. He was not an ethnic Jew, although Idumeans, again, were their cousins. Idumeans came from Esau. Jews came from Jacob. And so Herod, when he became ultimately the Romans, made him ruler over everything. He was like an Idumean prince, but they made him ruler over this whole thing. And when you look in the New Testament at the enmity between the Jews and Herod and the Idumeans in general, when you look, where did that come from? Came all the way from back here, from what was going on between Jacob and Esau. There is one book in the Bible which is about Edom, and it's the book of Obadiah. You probably never read it, or it's been a long time since you have read it. But if you go back and look at it, Obadiah is a one-chapter book. It's one sitting. You read Obadiah in about 15 minutes. And if the names weren't so hard to pronounce, you'd read it quicker than that. But Obadiah is God's pronouncement of judgment upon Edom. And mainly because of what they had done. It was written during this period of time when the Babylonians came in, and the Edomites had turned on their brothers. They were encouraging to the Babylonians. They were taking advantage of the Jews. They were trying to come into that power vacuum, and it's sort of like, we got kicked out of our country, so we're going to move into yours, and, this is now ours. So Idumea didn't, like when David and Solomon were around, there was no such place as Idumea. There was just Edom. But later on, they moved into the land, got about half converted, or at least saw themselves as more Jewish, and then contributed a king who was called Herod the Great. Probably the greatest builder of that era after Solomon was Herod. He built the temple. Right now, if you go over there, Herod's temple is not there except for the Wailing Wall. But Herod's temple, that great, magnificent building, the building that Jesus actually spoke in and drove the money changers out of the courts of that temple. That temple itself was built by Herod, Herod the Great. Why would Herod build such a magnificent thing for the Jewish people? He was trying to win their favor. He knew they hated him. He was trying to win them over. In addition to building an edifice which would be, he thought, a great monument to him. So, if you look at chapter 36, at the very beginning, we'll just look at a couple of verses. Now, these are the records of Esau, that is Edom. Esau took wives, and here's the key to the whole thing. Esau took wives from the daughters of Canaan. Adah, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, Olahoam, whatever, the daughter of Anah, and the granddaughter of Zibeon the Hivite. Also Basemath, Ishmael's daughter. Again, this is the same Ishmael, son of Abraham. Sister of Nebaioth, and Adah bore to, etc. Now we begin with the genealogies. So notice that his wives he married Canaanite women. And idolatry became a part of the heritage, although I think Esau, at least partly, worshiped Yahweh. Maybe not exclusively, but he did worship Yahweh. But the country of Edom became an idolatrous country. And again, you can look up in a Bible dictionary. It'll tell you who their main god was and things like this. But this was an idolatrous country that became a sworn enemy of Israel. Now, what happened to the Edomites? Well, after the Romans took over Israel for good. They had it when Jesus was there, but then the Israelis, the Jews revolted against them. They revolted a couple of times against them, and finally Rome had just had enough. And Rome came in, and that's the part of the time when they took over Jerusalem and knocked down the temple, just got rid of it. They not only wanted to get rid of Jews, but Judaism. Remember when Jesus was in the temple, he said that it's not too long from now that not one stone shall be set on another. That was a prophecy of that coming time in 70 AD, when the Romans would come in and take over again after one of these revolts. Well, over a period of time, intermarriage occurred, and they never ruled themselves as a country. And the Edomites, I'm sure God knows who the Edomites are, like God knows who all the Jews are in terms of what tribe they're. Most Jews now do not know what tribe they came from, but if there are still Edomites around, God knows who they are, but we don't. And so the country, in effect, ceased to exist, either over here on the east side of the Red Sea, or here in that Idumean section of Judah, chapter 37. Fascinating chapter. Now we turn to the story of Joseph. Joseph is about, when you look at the story of Joseph, almost 25% of the story of Genesis, of the chapters of Genesis, are about Joseph. God took 2 chapters to tell how he created the world. Took almost 20 chapters to tell the story of Joseph and what happened around that. Joseph was an extraordinary individual. There's only two people in the Bible about whom really nothing negative is said. Joseph did some things that were unwise early on, but in terms of actual rebellion against God, we don't find that. in the story of Joseph. Only two people in the Bible about whom everything is positive. One is Joseph, other than the Lord Jesus, of course. One is Joseph, and one is Daniel. And about them, there's nothing negative that's said at all. Chapter 37, we know that ultimately what God told Abraham a long time ago, he said, walk around it. Check it out, dude. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you the whole land, but not now. Right now, you're a sojourner in the land. You're a visitor in the land. Sooner or later, I'm going to give it to you. And he told Abraham that they would go into captivity and then come back as a mighty nation. So what God has got to do is he's got these people who live up here. And basically, the nation of Israel at this point consists of Jacob and his wives, and then the 12 sons and their families and hangers-on, etc. That's the nation of Israel. And God's plan is to, after the nation gets established, is to take them out of the land, to take them to Egypt, and then to bring them back when they have really become a nation. God's plan is to take them away from the Canaanites, and we see how destructive the Canaanites could be to them. We see what a temptation Canaanite religion, Canaanite morality was to the family of Jacob. And so what God wanted to do was to take them out of this land, which was under judgment already. God told Abraham the iniquity of the Amorite, and using that term is sort of synonymous for all the Canaanites. He said, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. He said, it's not ready. I'm going to judge them, but they're going to get worse before I judge them. And they're going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And then I will judge them, and I will judge them through you guys. But to do that, God's got to take them out. Number one, to put them in a place where they wouldn't intermarry with the people there, and they became slaves in Egypt, and so there was no intermarriage. To put them in a place where they could grow strong and wait for this to happen, and then God would bring them back. So the question is, if they live here right now, and ultimately they've got to live in Egypt, how does God get them from here to Egypt? That's what chapter 38 is all about, talking about how they got from there to Egypt. A little bit about what's going on here. Jacob is a really interesting guy because, I could tell you 10 things from Jacob's life and you would say, this guy is a spiritual giant. I could pick another 10 things from Jacob's life, and you'd say he's an utter scoundrel. I can't see how God could ever work with him. And it's all the same guy. And Jacob, after running away from God for so long and living as a cheat and a deceiver and one who wanted to do his own thing, did come back to God. Came there at Bethel, we saw it in that last chapter, where he returned to God and renewed his covenant, his vow, and God came and renewed the Abrahamic covenant. He gave the covenant to Abraham, and then he gave it to Isaac, and now he gives it to Jacob and says, you remember your granddaddy, Abraham, everything I told him, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it through you, and I'm going to do it through your sons. And so there's some great things about Abraham. Other things that aren't so good. Jacob. Jacob, for one thing, was not a great parent. We saw in the last chapter how that kind of lax parenting of Dinah, his daughter, led to the fact that she was hanging around with Canaanites in a place where she shouldn't have been. And so she got raped. And we saw what happened in that relationship with the Canaanites there. He was not a great father. And we'll see that in this chapter. Did not relate well to his kids, did not spend the time with his kids that he should have. and showed real favoritism. Isn't it odd? You know, one of the things they say about abused children tend to become abusers, and children who have grown in an abuse situation and they hated every minute of every hour of every day of the child abuse that they endured and hated their parents for doing it, and probably said at that point, one thing I will never do is I will never treat my kids this way. And so often they grow up to be abusers because that's what they have seen. That's their whole mental model of how to parent, as bad as it is. And so Jacob was not parenting well at all with his kids. He had his father had shown favoritism for Esau, even after God had told Isaac and Rebekah that I'm going to give the birthright to Jacob. Isaac tried to work around that and not do it. And so, of course, Jacob resorted to trickery and everything. God would have taken care of that without what Jacob did. But again, now he's doing so many of the same things with his kids. What you'll see in this chapter is that that Jacob is showing favoritism to his kids, and especially after there was in that last chapter, we see that his firstborn, Reuben, had gone in and slept with one of his concubines, probably as an effort to take over the family, because that was something that people did in those days, that like if you were going to try to take over, I don't know, maybe in today's world, you might try to get control of the bank accounts or the key to the family truck or something like that. In those days, when you were taking over, you slept with one of your father's concubines. When David was on the run and Absalom came into town, and Absalom, his son, had rebelled against David, and Absalom was trying to rip the kingdom from David. David was on the run with the people that sided with him. Absalom took his army into Jerusalem. What's the first thing he did? Went and slept with his father's concubine. Again, that's that establishment. And that's what Reuben did. And so Jacob had sort of written Reuben off. And you remember the wife that he loved so much was Rachel. And Joseph was Rachel's first son. And so Jacob's attention turned now to Joseph. And he treated him in such a special way. We will read about, and this is very famous, this is one of the most told stories in the Bible. It's one of the things that if you first learned about it when you were in Sunday school as a child. It's one of those stories that we tell a lot about Jacob and the coat of many colors. That, of course, was before Dolly Parton got a hold of it and did something else with it. But Jacob had this coat of many colors, which we don't know exactly. The Hebrew on that is real iffy, so that even the scholars are not sure exactly what that meant. What we do know for sure is that this coat, this tunic that he gave him, signified rulership, signified the fact that he was special. Some people have said that it seems from some of the grammar there that this was a long-sleeved tunic. Most people in that day, if you were in the fields or a worker or whatever, you wore short sleeve. And no one but people of power wore long sleeves. And that's just like showing that you had power. Just like back in the 1700s, nobody was fat except for wealthy people, because poor people couldn't afford to be. They didn't have the time, they didn't have the food. And so when you saw somebody in the 1600s or whatever that was overweight, you knew they were wealthy. Well, this was the same thing. We don't know exactly what there was about this tunic, but whatever it was, it really showed them that Jacob was the special guy. He was the chosen one. He was the one, that Joseph was the chosen one. And he was the one that Jacob was putting all of his attention on. When you look at this chapter, it is about the story of Joseph and how he gets to Egypt, but it is also the story of the sovereignty of God. And here you see that no matter that God is at work in this. And when you look at it, it's so easy to look at it and see, well, this is a kid who's naive and maybe a little cocky, and his brothers hate him and they intend to do evil. And so, again, we can't see the hand of God. And yet, the hand of God is all over this chapter. This chapter, you say, what's this chapter about? Two good answers. This chapter is about how Joseph winds up in Egypt as a slave. That's one answer. Number two, this chapter is about how God sovereignly works to do his will through people who are not paying any attention to him. You know, it's real easy to see how God can work through godly people. Sometimes it's hard to see how God can work through people who don't acknowledge him. And yet, that's exactly what he does. So, if you'll look at chapter 38, chapter 37, rather. Let's begin to go through it. Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. You can see Jacob as a little narc at this point who's telling on his brothers. Probably it was just that Joseph was being honest about what they were doing. Joseph saw that his father trusted him to give him a report. And Joseph, this was not a bad report that was a lie. This was a bad report that was the truth. And so he had spent time with his brothers in the field, and Joseph said, "What are they doing?" And we don't know what that was in terms of how they spent their time or what they did with the sheep or how dedicated they were to spending time doing what they should be doing as shepherds. We don't know what it was. Whatever it was, though, Joseph told the truth. And when his father asked him, "How's it going in the field?" Joseph told them. Now, Israel, notice now that the term Israel is now being called, Jacob is now being called Israel. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. His brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. And Joseph, of course, Jacob was wrong to let this kind of situation come up, to have such open favoritism of his son Joseph. But again, God's going to work through all this. We see how God can work through love. Is it harder to see how God can work through hate? They detested him. And part of the reason is because they could see already that Jacob was getting him ready for firstborn status, even though he was the number 11 son. Remember, there was one younger than him who was Benjamin, and when he was born, Rachel died. And so Benjamin was born, and Rachel died in the process of giving birth. And again, they could see what he was doing, and surely he could see it too, but he just let it go. Verse 5, then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up, and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. And then his brother said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Oddly enough, he was seen here as they were in the field. They were primarily shepherds, but also a little bit farmers, you know. And so they had these sheaves of grain, and Joseph's sheaf stood erect. I don't know whether he'd had pepperoni pizza before he went to sleep that night or what, but whatever it is, he had a really colorful dream, and his sheaf stood up, and all the others bowed down to him. And they immediately, now remember that this thing about dreams and the interpretation of dreams is going to become very important in Joseph's life. And it will be this ability that God has given him, both to give him dreams and to give him the interpretation, that God will use to bring him into Pharaoh's court. This is the first time we see this. We now know Joseph was a young man. He was not very mature in the way he handled this, and saying, but guys, I've got a dream, and guess what? The dream shows all of you acknowledging me as Lord, over the family, as master. And of course, they hated him already. They hated him before this came up. So you take your younger brother and you hate the ground he walks on. And he says, by the way, I've had a dream. And in my dream, all of you bow down to me. Well, that really helped, didn't it? And so they hated him ever more than they had. Now, verse 9. So now he had another dream and related it to his brothers and said, behold, I've had another dream. The sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related that to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come and bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him. Note the next phrase. But his father kept a saying in mind. I think Jacob knew that while sharing that might have not have been the wisest thing, I think Jacob probably knew that that was of God. And notice that that would literally happen. Everything they said. Notice the first dream was about grain. What was the issue that brought the brothers to Egypt? Grain. Not only about, and what did they do when they got there? Joseph was the ruler under Pharaoh. And when they got there, they all bowed down to him. And then later brought Jacob in, and he did that too. So literally everything, this is not something he's making up. God is giving him a vision of what was going to happen, literally. And of course, they all just hated Joseph for it. But Jacob maybe sensed that God was at work in this. And he said he kept that saying in mind. It kind of reminds you of when it said Mary taking all that she'd been told and pondering that in her heart. And so Everybody else hated Jacob. I hated Joseph. But Jacob is sitting back. He remembers it. And I'm sure he's wondering about, about what that really means in terms of what will happen and if that will really happen. Verse 12. Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. I guess Shechem had been rebuilt, repopulated now after they'd killed everybody in him. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come and I will send you to them." And you look at that and you think, did Jacob, didn't he wonder about, this is about maybe 50 miles or so from where he was. Did he not wonder about sending Joseph alone those 50 miles to go spend time with those people that he had to know hated him? But he sent him. And really he's sending them, he's not sending them there to work. He's not saying go join the crew. He's saying go see what's going on and then come tell me. Because he knows Joseph will tell him the truth. And if they're messing around, not taking care of the sheep, if they're letting sheep be stolen, if they're not working hard, Joseph will come back and tell them the truth. And he said to him, "I will go." And he said to them, "Now go and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Well, they weren't there. With shepherds, you have to move according to where the grazing is. And so maybe they grazed out that area and they heard that there was another place up near Dothan which had a lot of water and good pasturage. And so they followed it up there. And a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in a field. He was looking for his brothers. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they're pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They've moved from here. I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And they saw him from a distance. I guess they saw that coat. They saw him coming. And so they could see him over the hills or whatever. Obviously, it was going to be at least a half hour maybe before he would get there. And they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now come, let us kill him now and throw him into the pits. And we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' And then we will see what's become of his dreams." But Reuben, remember, Reuben is the firstborn. Reuben is the natural leader of the group. But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let's not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father." Reuben wasn't that much of a spiritual leader either. He, instead of saying, "This is wrong, we can't kill our brother," he just said it's not expedient. He said, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in the pit. And what Reuben had planned to do was to come back later, like after they left, like leave him in the pit, and then Reuben would excuse himself or whatever. He'd be gone for a while, and he'd come rescue his brother. Again, with the authority of a firstborn, he should have been able to do that, put his foot down and say, "No, we're not going to do it." But Reuben didn't do that. He was going to try to outsmart them instead. Well, whatever happened, Reuben did have something he needed to do, maybe off with part of the flock or something like that. Verse 23, so it came about when Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped him of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. It's called a cistern in older version, and a cistern is just a place that they had hewn out of the rock. It wasn't something they dug into the dirt. It was a place that literally they would hew out of the rock so it would hold water. And then during the rainy season, it would fill up with water, and it would be there. It's not a well. It is a place to collect water. And at this point, obviously, it was dry. And so the pit was empty without any water in it, and they put him down there. And then they sat down to eat a meal. Now, something has happened that Reuben, in the meantime, has left. He plans to come back. He'll leave with his brothers, and then in his mind, he's going to come back and get his brother out of the cistern. But something happens before he gets back. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming down from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us. Now, remember who did this? This is Judah who's saying this. Judah is the one who gives the alternative now and says, instead of killing him or leaving him to die, let's sell him. Let's actually make some money out of this thing. Let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up, lifted Joseph out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph to Egypt. This was not a great price, by the way. This was the price of just a common garden variety slave that they sold him for. This passage has been criticized a lot, and if you look back at it calls them in verse 25 a caravan of Ishmaelites. Verse 28, some Midianite traders. Later on in that, some Ishmaelites. And so, you know, our liberal friends have said, you see, this is a mistake in the Bible. Here it calls them Ishmaelites. There it calls them Midianites. What had happened is that remember that Midian is the descendants of Lot. And Ishmaelites are descendants of Ishmael. And there had been intermarriage. They lived in roughly the same place. They went on camel caravans together and trading and stuff like that. It would be sort of like if somebody found some stories about our football team in several hundred years. I don't think anybody's going to be here in several hundred years to find them. But if they did and they're reading about that football team, and in one of the places it calls them the Cowboys, and another place it calls them the Boys, and another place it calls them Dallas, another place it calls them the Silver and Blue, another place it calls them America's team. And he said, see, they had like 5 football teams in Dallas. Well, no, it's all just different names for the same thing. So America's team, the Dallas Cowboys, it's all the same thing. And so the same thing here, when you call them Midianites in one place and Ishmaelites in another, all refers to the same people, because in the caravan they were probably both Midianites and Ishmaelites. Verse 29, now Reuben returned to the pit. You see, and you can, like I say, this is a soap opera, because now you can almost hear the organ music swelling, you know, and Reuben returns to the pit, and you see that take he does as he looks and sees his brother is gone. He returned to his brothers and said, the boy's not here. And where am I to go? In other words, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? What's going to happen? So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood, and then they sent the vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. This has to be one of the cruelest things I can imagine. I know this was a dysfunctional family, and they were mad at their father for favoring their brother. But they knew how much he loved this kid. And they took this tunic and put blood on it, and they took it back. And notice they never said, your son is dead. They didn't lie. They gave it to him and said, here's this tunic. It's got blood on it. Is this your son's? And of course, Jacob went ahead and jumped ahead and figured, that his son had been killed. And they knew, and this, as you will see, this just tore him up. Verse 33, he examined it and said, it's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. So Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And then his sons and his daughters rose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. He refused to be comforted. And he said, in effect, no matter how long I live, I will die mourning for him. And they knew he wasn't dead. They knew what he had done. Can you imagine the cruelty of allowing your father to believe that and seeing him not just getting upset, they knew he'd do that, but like days and weeks, so that like it reads like they did an intervention or something like that. They came to him and said, Israel, you gotta shape up here. You got a family to run, an enterprise to run, a nation to head. You can't just spend all your time weeping and mourning and sad and living in constant depression. And he said, no matter what, he said, I will go down to Sheol. And Sheol here is the place of the dead. Remember when Jesus told the story of the rich man and Lazarus, not the one he raised from the dead, but another Lazarus, who died, and the rich man died and the poor man died, and they both were in Sheol. And there's two separate sections of Sheol. There's part of it that's called Abraham's bosom, and part of it that's the place of the dead. Remember, when you talk about, sometimes we say someone died and went to hell. Not technically, can't do that, because hell is the lake of fire, the second death. Who is in hell right now? Well, there's a special group of mean angels, demons, that are there right now. But other than that, there's no one there, no one in hell. Right now, they are in Sheol, and the part of Sheol that's the separation from God part. And the Bible says that in the last, when Jesus comes back after the millennium, he'll come back before the millennium, but after the millennium, that he will resurrect those people, unite them with resurrection bodies themselves, and they will stand before a judgment called the Great White Throne. And at that point, they will be cast into hell. So right now, someone who dies without Christ is in a terrible place of separation. When Lazarus looked at it, he said, read his description of it. He's saying this is a terrible, terrible place. It's a place of agony, asking for like one drop of water, but again, nothing. So they are in a terrible place right now. And so they will stay in that terrible place until the Great White Throne judgment. And then they'll be cast into a place that's worse than that. So Sheol really consists of two compartments, that the part of separation from God, and then the part of Abraham's bosom, which sometimes we call paradise. That's really a part for another study, but Sheol was also used as sort of synonym for the grave. And so he says, I will go down to the grave. And the last chapter, the last verse says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And so when the chapter begins, he is a favored son of Israel. And when the chapter ends, he is a slave to an Egyptian official. Why did this happen? Because God is in control. God knows that ultimately he's got to have that nation in Egypt, and he's got to bring them out. This is how the nation gets to Egypt. Benjamin Franklin wrote a little ditty about a horseshoe nail. And it goes like this. He said, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of the shoe, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of the battle, the kingdom was lost. All for want of a horseshoe nail. And it shows how one thing leads to another thing. And it begins with, I've just lost a horseshoe nail. But in the end, I end up losing a kingdom. Or it can work the other way around. And I'll leave you with this. I didn't write this. But it is a commentator who is talking about the importance of what happened to Joseph in the long run, the big picture of what this means. And it's, with kids, it's just a story about a young man who gets, with a coat of many colors, who gets sold into slavery. But what is that bigger picture? Listen to this, take about 2 minutes. If Joseph's family wasn't messed up and weird, his brothers would never have sold him as a slave. If Joseph's brothers never sold him as a slave, Joseph would never have gone to Egypt. If Joseph never went to Egypt, he never would have been sold to Potiphar. If Joseph was never sold to Potiphar, Potiphar's wife would never have falsely accused him of rape. If Potiphar's wife never falsely accused Joseph of rape, he would never have been put in prison. If Joseph was never put in prison, he would have never met the baker and butler of Pharaoh. If Joseph never met the baker and butler of Pharaoh, he would never have interpreted their dreams. If Joseph never interpreted their dreams, he would never have interpreted Pharaoh's dream. If Joseph never interpreted Pharaoh's dream, he would never have become prime minister, second in Egypt only to Pharaoh. If Joseph had never become prime minister, he would never have been wisely prepared for the terrible famine to come. If Joseph never wisely prepared for the terrible famine, his family back in Canaan would have died in the famine. If Joseph's family in Canaan had died in the famine, then the Messiah could not have come from a dead family. If the Messiah had not come, then Jesus never came. And if Jesus never came, we are all dead in our sins without hope in this world. And it all started with a 17-year-old kid being sold into slavery. And when we look at what's going on, we see, I'm sure that when Joseph was in the cistern or in jail in Egypt, when he looked at that, he never said, this is part of God's master plan. He never saw that. And it's hard for us to see it too. And if we do see it, it's because we say, Lord, I don't know why this has happened. I don't understand this situation. But I know that you do and that you're in control. And I'd like to say, Lord, show me this so I can believe. But if you don't show me this, I still believe. I know you're in control. I know that no matter what, you're working out your purposes. And I can rejoice in the middle of it. Indeed, I can thank you in the middle of this. 1 Thess 5:18 says, in everything give thanks. It didn't say in everything be thankful. Thankful is an emotion. You can't always just, oh, I'm just so thankful for this. You can't do that. That's not real. He didn't say be thankful in everything. He said give thanks in everything. Thankful is an act of the emotion. Thanks is an act of the will. And so I can say, Lord, I don't understand it. Lord, I really wish you hadn't done it. But you did. And you love me. And you're in control. So right now, I thank you for this situation. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you that you control it. Thank you that I'm trusting in Romans 8:28. And I didn't write this. You wrote it. And you said, Lord, that all things work together for good to those who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. Well, that's me. And so I guess you wrote that to me. And I thank you for it. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you so much for the truth of your word. Thank you that even though that we're looking at something that happened thousands of years ago to somebody we don't know, we can see you are the same God and you work in the same ways. And Lord, just like you were in control there with Joseph, you are in control with us. And you are sovereignly working out your will. Lord, help us to thank you in the middle of it, to be patient, to believe you no matter what. Father, bless our shepherd, our pastor, as he comes to lead us in a Bible study this morning. I pray that you would speak to us as we pray, as we worship, as we hear your word. And I pray that whether we're at home, as these folk are this morning, or here with us here in this building, I pray that you would speak to us today. In the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen. Thanks for joining us today.